Some men are haunted by ghosts. Griff Mallister was haunted by silence. A silence he swore on his brother's grave, a vow that had cost him 16 years of his life. For 16 years, he was a giant living on the edge of the world, a man who spoke only in grunts and nods, his voice buried alongside his only family. He was a ghost in his own story. Then one evening, as the sun bled across the canyon walls, a woman rode up to his door. Her name was Delilah Rose, a widow with eyes that had seen too much and a spine made of steel. And she asked him a question that didn't just break the silence. It threatened to burn his world down all over again. She sat on her horse, not with fear, but with the weary confidence of someone who had nothing left to lose. "Griff Mallister," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I've come to ask you a question." Griff just stared. He was a mountain of a man, 6'8" of weathered muscle and old scars, filling the doorway of his lonely cabin like a boulder blocking a cave. His eyes, the color of a frozen lake, hadn't held a real conversation in 16 years. The people in the town of Bitter Creek had learned to fear him, then to forget him. He was the hermit, the silent giant, the monster of the canyon. But Delilah didn't flinch. "The folks in town, they say your bed is cold and empty," she said, her words cutting straight through the years of quiet. "I need to know if that's true." The world stopped. The wind held its breath. For 16 years, Griff had lived with the ghosts of the past. The ghost of his brother, Jake, who died in his arms. The ghost of the man he used to be, a gunslinger whose name was once spoken with fear and respect across 3 territories. He had built this cabin with his own hands, a fortress against the world, a place where no one could get close enough to hurt him, or to get hurt because of him. And now, this woman, with the setting sun haloing her dark hair, was trying to walk right through the door. His throat was a desert. The words were there, locked away behind a wall of grief and guilt. The last real words he'd spoken were to Jake, a whispered promise as his brother's blood stained the floorboards of their old home. "I'll be quiet now, Jake. No more trouble, no more talk." Delilah shifted in her saddle. "Well, are you going to answer me? Or are we going to wait for the coyotes to start their evening song?" He could feel the dust in his lungs, the weight of 16 years pressing down. Inside the cabin, it was a monk's cell. 1 table, 1 chair, a bed with corners so sharp you could cut yourself on them. On the mantel, a single object. A blood-stained Bible, Jake's Bible, open to the page he was reading when the bullets flew. To everything there is a season, a time to keep silence, and a time to speak. Jake never got to the part about speaking. Griff's hand twitched. He wanted to gesture, to grunt, to make her go away like he did everyone else. But her eyes held him. They weren't filled with pity. They weren't filled with fear. They were filled with a desperate, familiar strength. "I know you can talk," she said, her voice softening just a little. "And I know you're not crazy, no matter what some say. You're just carrying a burden, and I'm here to offer you a trade." A trade? What could she possibly have that he wanted? He had his silence, he had his solitude, he had the dreams of his brother that came every night, a fresh hell to wake up to every morning. Delilah took a deep breath, and then she laid her cards on the table. "There's a man, Clayton Murdoch. He wants my stage stop, he wants the whole canyon, and he's given me an ultimatum." The name hit Griff like a physical blow. Clayton Murdoch, the land baron, the snake who owned judges and sheriffs, the man who started the feud that killed his brother, the man who walked away without a scratch while Griff's world burned to the ground. "He wants to marry me," Delilah said, her voice laced with venom, "to protect me and my property. He gave me 3 days to decide, but I'd sooner marry a rattlesnake." She paused, letting the words sink in. "So I'm making a different choice," she said, her gaze unwavering. "I need protection. The kind of protection that comes from a man whose very name makes Murdoch clench his teeth. And you need to come back to the world of the living." Her proposal hung in the air, audacious and insane. I can cook, she said simply. I can clean. I can handle a rifle. I won't ask you to talk more than you want to. It's a partnership, Mallister. A business deal. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper that sliced right through his armor. I'm not asking for love. I'm asking for a fortress, and in return, I'll make sure your bed is never empty again. He stared at her, this impossible woman offering him a deal with the devil to fight a bigger devil. For 16 years he'd believed his life was over. He was just waiting for the end. But as he looked at Delilah Rose, a flicker of something he thought long dead stirred in his chest. It was hope, and it scared him more than any gun ever had. The silence stretched, but it was different now. It was filled with the weight of her question. She wasn't just asking about his bed. She was asking if the man inside the hermit was still alive. He opened his mouth, and a sound came out, a rasp of dry air and disuse. It wasn't a word, but it was a start. Delilah didn't press. She just nodded, as if he'd answered her already. I'll be back at sunrise, she said, turning her horse. With the papers. You think on it, Griff. You think about whether you want to die alone in the dark, or fight back in the light. She rode away, leaving him standing in the doorway of his self-made prison. He looked back into the empty cabin, at the single chair, the cold fireplace, the blood-stained Bible. For the first time in 16 years, the silence didn't feel like a penance. It felt like a cage. And Delilah Rose had just handed him the key. The question was, did he have the courage to turn it? The next morning, she returned. True to her word, she arrived as the first rays of sun crested the canyon, but she wasn't alone. Trailing behind her was Reverend Walsh, the town preacher, looking nervous and clutching his Bible like a shield. Griff stood in the same spot, as if he hadn't moved all night. He hadn't. He'd spent the night wrestling with ghosts, with a past he couldn't change and a future he never thought he'd have. I brought a witness, Delilah said, dismounting. She held out a folded piece of paper. And a contract, a simple business arrangement. You provide protection, I provide a home, all legal and binding. Griff took the paper. His calloused fingers, scarred from 100 fights and a decade of lonely labor, brushed against hers. He felt a jolt, a spark of human contact he hadn't allowed himself in years. He read the contract. It was exactly as she'd said, a marriage of convenience, no mention of emotion, no false promises, just a mutual agreement for survival. He looked from the paper to her face, then to the nervous preacher. This was real. This was happening. There's one more thing you need to know, Delilah said, her voice low. My first husband, Thomas. He ran the stage stop before me. He was killed. They said it was road agents, a robbery gone wrong. Griff looked up, his eyes narrowing. He saw the lie she'd been telling herself. It wasn't random, was it? He rasped, the words tearing at his throat. Delilah shook her head, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. No, he had refused to sell to Murdoch 3 times. The week after he was killed, Murdoch made his first generous offer to me, the grieving widow. The pieces clicked into place. This wasn't just about her land. This was about justice. It was about revenge. She wasn't just looking for a shield. She was looking for a sword. And she had come to the most dangerous sword in the territory. I'd rather take my chances with a ghost than give that snake what he wants, she whispered, her gaze locking with his. So I ask you again, Griff Mallister, will you stand with me? He looked at the contract in his hand, at the hope and desperation in her eyes. He thought of Jake, of the promise of silence he'd made. But was this silence honoring his brother? Or was it letting the man who killed him win, letting him take everything, just like he took Jake? Slowly, deliberately, he looked at Reverend Walsh. He opened his mouth, and this time, a word came out. A single, clear, life-altering word. Yes. The relief on Delilah's face was so profound, she swayed on her feet. The Reverend let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Griff felt like a dam had broken inside him. One word. It was a start. He pointed to the contract, then to the preacher. "Now," he said, his voice a low rumble. The ceremony was the strangest in Bitter Creek's history. It took place right there on the porch of the hermit's cabin, with the canyon as their cathedral and the rising sun as their witness. The Reverend stammered through the vows, his eyes darting between the enormous silent groom and the fiercely determined bride. When Walsh asked if he, Griffin, would take Delilah, another yes came, stronger this time. When he asked Delilah, her "I do" was as firm as a rock. "You may, kiss the bride," the Reverend finished, sweating despite the morning chill. Griff froze. He hadn't touched another person with any intent besides violence in 16 years. Delilah saw the panic in his eyes. She smiled, a small, reassuring gesture. Then she rose on her toes and pressed a gentle kiss to his rough, bearded cheek. He felt a tremor go through his entire body. It wasn't desire. It was life. A jolt of warmth in a world of cold. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Walsh declared, hastily closing his book. And just like that, the loneliest man in 3 territories was a husband. The ghost of Bitter Creek Canyon had a wife. As the Reverend beat a hasty retreat back to town, Delilah turned to Griff. "I know this is a lot, but we don't have time. Murdoch's men will be watching the town. They'll know I didn't accept his proposal. They'll be coming." Griff nodded. He disappeared into the cabin and emerged a moment later with a heavy gun belt, one he hadn't worn in 16 years. It was his father's Colt, a weapon that felt like a part of his own arm. He strapped it on, the familiar weight both a comfort and a curse. "Where do we start?" Delilah asked. Griff looked down the long, winding road that led from his isolated cabin to the town, to the stage stop, to Clayton Murdoch. For the first time, he didn't see it as a path of retreat. He saw it as a battleground. "We start," he said, his voice gaining strength with every word. "By showing Murdoch, he didn't just gain a new neighbor. He gained a new war." He looked at Delilah, his wife, this brave, reckless woman who had ridden into his silence and demanded he fight back. He didn't know if they would live to see the end of the week, but as he stood there, the sun on his face and a gun on his hip, he felt more alive than he had in 16 years. The silence was broken, and all hell was about to break loose with it. Moving into the cabin was like trying to fit a songbird into a shoebox. Delilah's belongings, few as they were, seemed to fill the Spartan space with an overwhelming sense of life. She brought curtains, a rocking chair, and a wooden box filled with recipes from her mother. Each item was a rebellion against the cabin's bleak emptiness. Griff watched her, a silent giant moving through his own home as if he were a guest. He'd lived a life of rigid routine. Coffee, black, biscuits, hard, chores, endless. Now the smell of onions and herbs filled the air. Delilah was making a stew, a real meal, and the aroma alone felt like an invasion. "My grandmother used to say a woman who could cook would never be lonely," she said, not looking at him. Of course, she also said a woman who could shoot straight would never be helpless. I learned both. A flicker of something, approval maybe, crossed Griff's face. He liked that. Practical skills, self-reliance. That night, the tension was a third person in the room. Griff had dragged a trunk from under the bed and started laying out blankets on the floor. "I'll sleep here," he grunted. Delilah stopped him. "No, this is a partnership, not a punishment. The bed is big enough. I trust you to be a gentleman." The look he gave her was one of sheer, unadulterated shock. Trust. It was a foreign currency in his world. He nodded slowly, the rigid lines of his shoulders relaxing for the first time all day. Lying in the dark, separated by a chasm of unspoken history, was stranger than any battle Griff had ever fought. He could feel her warmth, smell the scent of soap and lavender from her hair. It was agonizing. It was wonderful. He lay perfectly still, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, fighting a war within himself. The next few days passed in a strange domestic rhythm. Delilah brought warmth and order to the cabin. Griff started speaking more, his voice slowly shedding its rust. He'd answer her questions with a single word, then two. Soon he was telling her about his cattle, about the way the light hit the canyon at dawn. But the past was always there, lurking in the shadows. One afternoon while cleaning, Delilah found it. Tucked away on the highest shelf of a small closet, wrapped in oilcloth, was a hat. A battered cowboy hat, too small for Griff. The leather was worn, the brim soft with age. "That was Jake's." Griff's voice came from the doorway, so full of pain it was almost a whisper. Delilah held it gently. "Your brother." He nodded, stepping inside. The carefully constructed piece of the last few days shattered. He was always losing it. I must have ridden 100 miles over the years, backtracking to find where he'd left it. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, then vanished. The day they came, he was reading, right over there. He pointed to the fireplace. He was reading about a time to be born and a time to die. "He never finished the passage," Delilah said softly. Griff stared at her, his eyes wide with surprise. "How did you know?" "Because I know that kind of pain," she said, "the kind that cuts a life off mid-sentence." And for the first time, she told him about her husband, Thomas. How he'd been ambushed on the road, how she'd found him, still clutching a letter he was writing to his sister, talking about their plans to start a family. The wall between them crumbled. In that moment, they weren't a hermit and a widow. They were two survivors, two people who understood the language of loss. "I'm sorry," Griff said, and the words were real, full of a compassion he thought he'd lost forever. "I'm sorry about Jake," she replied. That night, the conversation changed. He told her about growing up with Jake, about their dreams of building a ranch together. She told him about her life before Murdoch, the simple joys and the quiet hopes. They were building a bridge across their shared grief, one story at a time, but the outside world would not leave them be. A few days later, 3 riders appeared on the ridge. Griff saw them from a mile away. His body went rigid, the gentle rancher vanishing, replaced by the predator he used to be. It was Silas Crenshaw, Murdoch's foreman, a weasel-faced man with dead eyes, flanked by 2 hired guns. "Mallister!" Crenshaw called out, his voice dripping with mock pleasantry. "Mr. Murdoch sent us to see how married life is treating you." His eyes raked over Delilah, insolent and ugly. "We're fine," Griff said, his voice flat and dangerous. He moved to stand slightly in front of Delilah. "Glad to hear it," Crenshaw sneered. "Mr. Murdoch is a man who likes to see things settled. Speaking of which, he was looking over some old survey maps. Says there might be some question about where your property line really is." The threat was clear. It was the same tactic Murdoch used on everyone. Drown them in legal trouble, bleed them dry, then take their land for pennies on the dollar. "There's no question," Griff said, his hand moving to rest on the butt of his Colt. "Now get off my land." The air crackled with tension. Crenshaw's men tensed, their hands hovering over their own guns. For a moment, the canyon was going to erupt in violence. Then Crenshaw laughed, a grating, ugly sound. "We'll be seeing you, Mallister, you and your pretty new wife. Mr. Murdoch always gets what he wants. Always." They rode off, leaving a trail of dust and menace behind them. "He's not going to stop," Delilah said, her voice trembling slightly. "I know," Griff replied. He was staring after the riders, but his eyes were seeing 16 years into the past. He was seeing his brother fall. That evening the mood was somber. The brief peace they had found was gone. The war was here. "Was there ever anyone else?" Delilah asked quietly, trying to pull him back from the edge. "Before all this?" Griff was silent for a long time. "Once," he finally said. "Her name was Sarah, a doctor's daughter. We were going to be married." "What happened?" "Jake died," he said simply, as if that explained everything. "I took my oath of silence. I became this. I couldn't ask her to live with a ghost, so I drove her away." The pain in his voice was a raw, open wound. Delilah reached across the table and took his hand. His large, calloused fingers engulfed hers. "You were protecting her," she said. "Or was I just a coward?" he whispered, his thumb tracing patterns on her skin. The touch was electric. All the unspoken things between them, all the tension and the growing affection, sparked in that single point of contact. "You're not a coward, Griff," she said, her voice firm. "You're the bravest man I've ever met. You're just wounded." His eyes, those frozen lakes, began to melt. He looked at her, at this woman who had stormed his fortress and refused to leave, this woman who saw the man beneath the monster. "Delilah," he started, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "You make me want things I gave up on 16 years ago." The air in the cabin was thick with unspoken words. This was no longer a business arrangement. It had never really been one. It was two broken people, finding the missing pieces of their souls in each other. But even as they leaned closer, a new, more terrifying thought entered Griff's mind. Murdoch wasn't just coming for his land. He was coming for Delilah. And Murdoch had a secret weapon, a secret Griff couldn't possibly imagine, one that would rewrite the entire history of his pain. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, carried by a terrified boy from the post office who looked like he'd seen a ghost. The envelope was thick, expensive, sealed with the red wax crest of Murdoch Holdings. Griff's blood ran cold before he even opened it. He broke the seal. Inside were two documents. The first was a formal legal notice. Murdoch, with the help of a corrupt territorial judge, was officially challenging the land grants for not just Griff's property, but for nearly every independent rancher in the valley. It was a declaration of total war, a legal maneuver to steal an entire territory. But it was the second letter, a personal note penned in Murdoch's own spidery hand, that shattered Griff's world. "Mallister," it began, "I thought you might appreciate the full story. You've spent 16 years blaming yourself for your brother's death. You've lived in silence, punishing yourself for being too slow, too weak to protect him. But you've been mourning the wrong sin." Griff's hands began to shake. Delilah watched him, her face pale. "You see, my men didn't just get lucky that day. They had a map. They knew where you kept your weapons. They knew your plans. They knew Jake would be alone. Someone told them, someone you trusted, someone Jake trusted. Someone who sat at your table, ate your food, and called you brother." Griff let out a choked sound, a strangled gasp of disbelief. "He had a gambling problem, you see. Owed me a considerable sum. I offered him a simple way to clear his debt. Your ranch, for his life. He took the deal. A shame he got greedy later and tried to blackmail me. He learned the hard way that I don't like loose ends. So you see, Griff, you didn't fail Jake. He was sold out, betrayed by his best friend. His blood is on Tom Patterson's hands. And mine, of course. Give my regards to your lovely wife. I do hope she proves more loyal than your friends." The letter fell from Griff's nerveless fingers. Tom Patterson, his partner, the man who had been like a second brother to him and Jake, the man who had held him back at the funeral, telling him vengeance would only lead to more pain. It was all a lie. 16 years of guilt, 16 years of silence, all built on a lie. He wasn't a failure, he was a fool. "Griff?" Delilah whispered, picking up the letter. She read it, her eyes widening in horror. "Oh, Griff. No." A sound started deep in Griff's chest. It was a low growl that grew into a roar of pure, undiluted rage. It was the sound of 16 years of pain, grief, and misplaced guilt exploding to the surface. He swept the plates from the table, sending them shattering against the stone fireplace. He kicked the chair, sending it splintering against the wall. This wasn't grief. This was fury. Cold, pure, absolute. The oath of silence, the penance he had inflicted on himself, it was all a joke. A cruel joke orchestrated by the man who had murdered his brother and stolen his life. "He's been playing with me," Griff snarled, the words ripping from him. "For 16 years he's been watching me rot in this canyon, knowing the truth. He did this to break you, Delilah said, her voice shaking, but her eyes clear. He wants you to fall apart before the real fight even begins. But she was wrong. The letter didn't break him. It freed him. The guilt that had shackled him for 16 years was gone, burned away in a fire of righteous hatred. The hermit of Bitter Creek was dead. In his place, something terrible and beautiful was being reborn. He walked to the old sea chest at the foot of his bed, a chest he hadn't opened since the day he buried Jake. He threw back the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was his other gun belt. Not his father's simple Colt, but his own. The matched pair of custom-made peacemakers that had earned him the name, the Ghost of the Plains. They were weapons of death, and he had sworn never to touch them again. He strapped on the belt. The weight felt right. It felt like coming home. He turned to Delilah, and she saw a man she didn't recognize. The sadness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a glacial fire. The stoop in his shoulders was gone, replaced by the deadly stillness of a coiled snake. This was the man legends were written about. He made a mistake, Griff said, his voice a low, chilling whisper that promised retribution. He wanted to torment me with the truth. He checked the action on his revolvers. The metallic clicks echoed in the small cabin like a death knell. But all he did, Griff said, looking out the window toward Murdoch's lands, was give me back my reason to kill. The silence was over. The mourning was over. The war had just begun, and Griffin Mallister was finally ready to fight it. Murdoch thought he was fighting a broken hermit. He was about to find out he had awakened a legend, and legends don't die easy. Word of Murdoch's legal assault spread through the valley like a plague. Families who had worked their land for generations were suddenly facing eviction, their life's work threatened by a piece of paper from a corrupt judge. Fear was a palpable thing, a cold fog that settled over the small ranches and homesteads. But Murdoch had miscalculated. He thought fear would make them scatter. Instead, it brought them together. The meeting was held at Tom Henderson's ranch, the oldest in the valley. Henderson was 73, his hands gnarled by arthritis, but his eyes were sharp and his will was iron. One by one, the ranchers arrived. The Crawford brothers, grim-faced miners turned farmers. The Murphy clan, a boisterous family of Irish immigrants. Even Reverend Walsh was there, his Bible in one hand, a shotgun in the other. They looked to Griff. He was their last hope, the legend they had only heard whispers about. Griff stood before them, Delilah at his side. He was a changed man. The gun belt on his hips was not just a weapon, it was a symbol. He was no longer hiding. Murdoch thinks he's already won, Griff began, his voice ringing with an authority they had never heard. He has the law on his side. He has the money. He has an army of hired killers. He paused, letting the grim reality sink in. What he doesn't have, Griff continued, his eyes scanning the faces of his neighbors, is you. He doesn't understand that a man will fight harder for his home than a hired gun will ever fight for a wage. He then told them the truth. He read Murdoch's letter aloud, the one confessing to Jake's murder, and the betrayal that had led to it. A wave of shock and anger rippled through the crowd. This wasn't just about land anymore. This was about a poison that had been seeping into their valley for 16 years. He thinks this is his valley, Griff said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. I say we show him he's trespassing. A cheer went up. It wasn't loud, but it was resolute. It was the sound of cornered people deciding to fight back. But as they planned their defense, a new, chilling thought took root in Griff's mind. Murdoch's letter had been so specific, so cruel. It was designed to inflict maximum pain. But what if it was also another lie? What if Tom Patterson wasn't the real traitor? The idea was poison. Murdoch had revealed one betrayal to shatter Griff's past. What if he'd invented it to shatter his future? To make him trust no one, to isolate him right before the final battle? To make him look for a ghost while the real traitor stood right beside him? He looked around the room. At old Tom Henderson, whose family had been friends with his for decades. At the Crawford brothers, who he barely knew. At Reverend Walsh, A man of God. Who could it be? Or was he just letting Murdoch's mind games get to him? He pushed the thought aside. He had to focus. They had a defense to plan. The Crawford brothers, with their knowledge of explosives from the mines, devised a plan to turn the canyon into a trap. "We can rig the pass," the elder Crawford explained, drawing in the dirt. "Create a rock slide, funnel them into a kill box right here." Tom Henderson organized the riflemen. "We'll use the high ground, hit them from 3 sides. They won't know what's coming." Delilah had a plan of her own. "The stage stop," she said. "It's the only building of any size. They'll try to take it, to use it as a command post. We can fortify it, but we can also set a trap inside." Griff listened, a grim pride swelling in his chest. These were not soldiers, but they were determined. They were fighting for their lives. But the seed of doubt remained. A traitor. If there was one, their plans were useless. They would be walking into their own trap. That night, Griff confided in Delilah. "I can't shake it," he said, pacing their small cabin. The letter, it felt too perfect, too cruel, like a story crafted to destroy a man. "You think Murdoch lied about the betrayal?" Delilah asked, her eyes searching his. "I think Murdoch would do anything to win," Griff replied. "What if the real traitor is still out there, listening to our plans, waiting to sell us out, just like Jake was sold out?" Delilah put a hand on his arm, stopping his pacing. "Then we trust no one but each other, and we plan for it. We make a plan for our neighbors, and a different plan for ourselves." It was a brilliant, simple idea. A public plan that the traitor could report back to Murdoch, and a secret plan, known only to Griff and Delilah. A final, desperate gambit if everything else failed. The next day, as they finalized their public strategy with the other ranchers, Griff felt a chill run down his spine. He watched his neighbors, his new allies, trying to see past their determined faces to the potential darkness within. Every friendly face could be a mask. Every word of support could be a lie. This was Murdoch's true victory. He had not only started a war for the land, he had started a war for their souls, turning neighbor against neighbor, trust into suspicion. As the sun set on the eve of the battle, the valley was quiet. Too quiet. It was the silence of a held breath. 13 ranchers, including Delilah, against an army of more than 30 professional killers. The odds were impossible. Griff and Delilah stood on their porch, watching the shadows lengthen. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said softly, "I don't regret it. I don't regret waking you up." "I don't regret it either," Griff said, taking her hand. His hand, once made only for violence, was now a source of comfort. "For 16 years I was a dead man walking. You brought me back to life. If I die tomorrow, I'll die as the man I was supposed to be." He looked into her eyes. The marriage had been a contract, a business deal, but it had become something more. In the crucible of shared danger, they had forged a bond stronger than any legal paper. It was a partnership of souls. "I love you, Delilah," he said, the words feeling more natural than any he had spoken in his life. "I love you too, Griff," she whispered. They knew they might not survive to see another sunset, but as they stood there, united against the coming storm, they were not afraid. They had something to fight for. They had each other, and they had one last secret, a desperate final trap for Clayton Murdoch, a secret that would either save them all or get them killed. Dawn broke, cold and gray. The signal came just as the sun touched the canyon rim. 3 rifle shots, echoing like the crack of doom. They were coming. From their vantage point, Griff and Delilah watched the dust cloud rise in the distance. It was an army. More than 30 riders moving with the disciplined arrogance of professional killers. At their head, a man on a fine black horse, Clayton Murdoch himself, come to personally oversee his victory. "Get to your position," Griff told Delilah, his voice calm and steady. "Remember the plan. Our plan." She squeezed his hand. "You too, Griff. Don't be a hero." He smiled, a rare, grim flash of teeth. Too late for that. He watched her scramble up the rocks to the sniper's nest they had prepared, her rifle in hand. Then he turned and walked down into the open, positioning himself in the middle of the canyon road. A lone figure against an advancing army. It was madness. It was a statement. "I am here. Come and get me." Murdoch's army reined in 100 yards away. The silence was deafening, broken only by the snorting of horses and the creak of leather. "Griffin Mallister!" Murdoch's voice was amplified by the canyon walls. "I gave you a chance to leave. Now, I will simply paint this valley with your blood and the blood of your pathetic friends." "This valley was never yours, Murdoch!" Griff's voice roared back, the voice of a man who had rediscovered his thunder. "You're a thief and a murderer, and your time is up." He pulled the sheriff's badge from his pocket, an old, tarnished star given to him by the aging and now dead Sheriff Morrison, who had been found with a bullet in his back just days earlier. Murdoch's work, no doubt. "By the authority of the Montana Territory, I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Jake Mallister and Sheriff Morrison." Murdoch threw his head back and laughed. "You and what army, Mallister?" "This one," Griff said. And all hell broke loose. The first shot was not from Griff. It was from the rocks above. Delilah. A puff of smoke, and one of Murdoch's lead riders tumbled from his saddle, a neat hole in his forehead. The canyon erupted. From the ridges on both sides, the ranchers opened fire. It was a perfectly executed ambush. Murdoch's men, caught in a three-way crossfire, panicked. Their disciplined formation broke as men and horses screamed and fell. Then came the explosions. The Crawford brothers had done their work well. A section of the canyon wall came crashing down, sealing the exit. Murdoch's army was trapped. Griff was a whirlwind of motion. His twin peacemakers bucked in his hands, a symphony of death. He moved with an unnatural speed and grace, a phantom in the gun smoke. He wasn't just a man fighting. He was a force of nature, 16 years of rage unleashed. But Murdoch's men were professionals. They recovered quickly, taking cover, returning fire with vicious accuracy. The battle turned from an ambush into a brutal, grinding firefight. The ranchers were good, but they were outnumbered. The air filled with the coppery scent of blood and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Griff saw Tom Henderson go down, clutching a bloody shoulder. One of the Crawford brothers lay still behind his rock barricade. The tide was turning. Sheer numbers were starting to win. Then Griff's worst fear came true, the betrayal. He saw Reverend Walsh, who was supposed to be covering the western flank, deliberately aim his shotgun not at Murdoch's men, but at the back of the remaining Crawford brother. The blast echoed in the canyon. The rancher fell. The traitor wasn't a ghost from the past. He was here, now, the man of God. Griff's blood ran ice cold. Murdoch's letter was a lie, a brilliant, evil lie to send him hunting for the wrong man. Reverend Walsh, the man who had married them, the man who had quoted scripture as he planned their defense, was the snake in their garden. "It's over, Mallister!" Walsh screamed, his face twisted in a mask of fanaticism. "Mr. Murdoch is the hand of progress. You are standing in the way of the future." The revelation sent a shockwave through the defenders. The momentary hesitation was all Murdoch's men needed. They surged forward, overwhelming the ranchers' positions. It was a rout. Griff fought like a demon, trying to get to Walsh, but he was pinned down, bullets kicking up dirt all around him. He saw Delilah, her position about to be overrun. He had to get to her. Then, a new sound cut through the chaos. A whistle, high and sharp. It was Delilah. She stood up from behind her cover, not with a rifle, but with a lit stick of dynamite in her hand. Her face was grim, her eyes locked on the main support beam of the stage stop's wide porch, where Murdoch and his inner circle, including Walsh, had taken cover. This was their secret plan, the suicide gambit. "Griff!" she screamed. "Now!" He understood. He fired his last 2 bullets, not at the enemy fighters, but at the 2 small concealed barrels of oil he and Delilah had rolled under the porch the night before. The barrels exploded. The front of the stage stop was engulfed in a fireball. Delilah threw the dynamite. It sailed through the air in a perfect arc, landing right in the heart of the inferno. The resulting explosion was catastrophic. The entire front of the building disintegrated in a shower of splintered wood and fire. The blast wave threw Griff backward, and the last thing he saw before the world went black was the image of Clayton Murdoch and the treacherous Reverend Walsh being consumed by the flames. Silence descended upon the canyon, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the moans of the wounded. It was over, one way or another. Griff pushed himself up, his ears ringing. The canyon floor was a scene from a nightmare. Bodies lay scattered everywhere. The proud stage stop was a burning ruin. He staggered forward, his eyes searching frantically. "Delilah?" he croaked, his voice raw. "Delilah!" He found her near the edge of the blast zone, thrown clear by the explosion. She was unconscious, a gash on her forehead, but she was breathing. She was alive. He fell to his knees beside her, gathering her into his arms, tears streaming down his face, washing away the dust and blood. He had been ready to die. They both had. But somehow, in the midst of all the death, they had survived. The few remaining ranchers, bloodied but alive, emerged from their cover, staring in stunned silence at the devastation. They had won. The cost had been terrible, but they had won. Griff held his wife close, burying his face in her hair. The silence he had once cherished as a shield was gone forever. It had been replaced by the sound of her heartbeat against his chest. The war for Bitter Creek was over. The war for his soul was over. He looked up at the smoke-filled sky, the sun trying to break through the haze. It was a new day, a painful, brutal, beautiful new day. And for the first time in 16 years, Griff Mallister was truly free. The rebuilding of Bitter Creek was not done with hammers and nails alone. It was done with shared meals, with silent nods of respect between survivors, with the communal effort of burying the dead. They had lost good people. Tom Henderson's son, one of the Crawford brothers, good men who had died for their homes. But in their shared grief, the community was forged into something stronger than steel. Griff was no longer the hermit. He was a leader, the man who had walked out of the silence and faced down an army. But he was also just Griff, the man who helped the widowed Mrs. Henderson rebuild her fence, the man who sat with the surviving Crawford brother and shared a bottle of whiskey without saying a word. Delilah recovered quickly, her spirit as unbreakable as ever. The gash on her forehead would leave a scar, a permanent reminder of the day she brought fire and ruin to their enemies. She wore it like a badge of honor. The stage stop was a charred ruin, but she already had plans for a new one, bigger and better, a true heart for their reborn community. The territorial government, shamed into action by the scale of Murdoch's crimes and the heroic defense of the valley, finally intervened. They sent marshals to clean up the last of Murdoch's network. The corrupt judge was impeached. Murdoch's vast holdings were broken up, with much of the land being deeded back to the families he had terrorized. Justice, slow and ponderous, had finally arrived. About a month after the battle, as the first new beams of the stage stop were being raised, Griff found Delilah looking out over the valley. "I've been thinking," she said. "That's usually when the trouble starts," he teased, his voice now easy and familiar. She smiled and leaned against him. "Our first wedding was rushed, a business deal, on the porch of a hermit's cabin." "I remember," he said. "I think we should do it again," she said, turning to face him. "For real this time, in a church, or what's left of it, with all our friends, a celebration, a beginning." Griff looked into her eyes, the eyes of the woman who had saved him in every way a person can be saved. He saw the love there, the strength, the shared future. "There's nothing I'd want more," he said. Their second wedding was a testament to the new Bitter Creek. The entire valley attended. The ceremony was held in the open air, with the mountains as their witness. Tom Henderson, his arm in a sling, stood as Griff's best man. Delilah, in a simple blue dress she had sewn herself, looked more beautiful than any queen. When Griff said, "I do," his voice was full of a joy that echoed off the canyon walls. When Delilah said hers, she was crying and laughing at the same time. The kiss was not the tentative peck of strangers, but the deep, knowing embrace of two halves of a single soul. That night, they sat on the porch of their cabin, which was no longer a fortress, but a home. They had added a room, and Delilah's rocking chair was a permanent fixture. "Do you ever miss the silence?" she asked softly. Griff thought for a moment, listening to the crickets and the distant laughter from the town. "No," he said. "The silence was just loneliness in disguise. The best sound in the world is this." He leaned his head against hers, and they sat there, listening to the quiet sounds of a peaceful valley, the sounds of a life they had fought for and won. A few years later, the new stage stop was the busiest in the territory. The valley was prosperous, and on the porch of a cabin, high on the canyon wall, a giant of a man would sit, rocking a small child in his arms, a boy with his father's size and his mother's fiery spirit. He would point out the constellations to the boy, and sometimes he would tell him a story about a man who lost his voice and a woman who helped him find it again. A story about how even in the deepest silence, hope can whisper, and how some things, love, home, and freedom, are always worth fighting for. He had walked through the fire and emerged whole, his heart no longer a cold, empty place. His bed was never empty, his home was filled with laughter, and the silence was finally at peace. If you enjoyed this story of redemption and a love that conquered all, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss the tale of betrayal and justice we have coming for you next.